Over the years, I've made a lot of outdoor furniture, and being, my original career was in science, I have a sort of natural curiosity, and I like to experiment with things. Outdoor furniture is a fun place to do that, and that's what this video is all about. We're going to go and look at pieces that I've made over the years, different finishes that I put on them, where they live, and how they have fared over time. And we'll really start to examine what these finishes do in different environments and on different species of wood. And one thing to keep in mind with this, I've lived in Phoenix and Denver, and this is one set of conditions that these furniture pieces have been exposed to, and I can't guarantee that it's going to be the same somewhere else. So this is just my personal experience, my observations, and my own opinions. You might have different experiences. All right, so with that, let's go take a look at my Adirondack chairs. Built in 2011 back in Arizona from Honduran mahogany, these beauties are now 10 years old. Because I love to experiment, one chair was finished with Sikkens Cetol Marine. This is pretty much an oil-based finish with UV absorbing pigments and resins. The other was finished with Watco Teak oil. This is a thin oil varnish blend that also contains UV absorbers, but it doesn't have any pigments, and it doesn't build to a thick film like the Sikkens product. 6 years later, after lots of Arizona heat and sun, as well as 1 year of exposure in Denver, these chairs were in a sad state. Both finishes were deteriorating, but the Watco Teak oil finish was the worst of the two. Keep in mind, some people love this weathered gray look, and that's totally okay. I'm just not a fan. The Sikkens Cetol chair maintained more of its color thanks to the colored pigments, and those pigments really help to protect the wood grain from excessive deterioration and damage. The Teak oil chair required a lot more sanding to get down to smooth wood. So while both finishes were at the point of failure, the Sikkens definitely did a better job of protecting the wood. After sanding, I applied the same finish to both chairs. This time, I went with CPES as a sealer. This is an epoxy-based product that is often used under marine varnishes for what's supposed to be an incredibly durable finish. As you'll see, it can be, but no wood finish will survive extensive neglect. For the top coat, I went with Epifanes, a durable, oil-based marine varnish. I also added a thick epoxy coating to the feet, which is something that I do to all my outdoor furniture now. End grain tends to soak up a lot of moisture from the ground, and it can cause the table and chair legs to get really nasty over time, and that epoxy layer definitely helps to defend against that. So the chairs were put back in service in 2017 and have spent the rest of the time here on my front porch. We've got some partial cover here. There's an overhang on the side of the house, and then we have a patio cover that extends forward. They still get wet, they still get rained on, a little bit of snow here and there, and they also get a couple hours of sun every day, but not a lot of sun, and I think that's key to why they look as good as they do now. And speaking of that, let's actually take a look at the chairs and see if we can find some flaws. Now overall, I gotta say this finish has held up really well. It's been 4 years that it's been sitting out here, and for the most part, it's intact. Right, so I do see a couple of trouble areas and areas where I would expect them. Any corners or anything that you're going to interact with by sitting on it or touching it will likely result in the finish failing sooner than the rest. So let's look at this front rail here. That's where the most damage is. So this part is actually really facing up, so this is getting the brunt of the UV exposure, but also it's kind of a double whammy. The back of your legs and your clothes will rub on this when you sit in this chair. So this is probably where I would expect it to start to wear the most. So yeah, of course we see some raw wood under there. This will definitely need to be touched up. On the armrest here, we have some ebony plugs. That's a hallmark of the green and green style. But ebony plugs, we tend to buff them prior to actually putting them in the piece. Well, the problem with a really finely buffed surface, especially something as hard as ebony, is that it doesn't really absorb much finish. So this is what I would expect to see over time. The finish is starting to crack and bubble because it actually doesn't have that great of a grip on the ebony. This crack here, that is from a previous repair, but that epoxy has held up great, and a little bit of wear and tear here on the corners. Now I flipped this guy over. I mean, the underside I wouldn't expect to see very much under here, but when I look at the feet, you might think that that's a lot of damage, but what this actually is the epoxied feet. This is a technique that I do a lot these days, on outdoor furniture. I put an epoxy pad, essentially I build up a dam with tape, fill it with epoxy, and this way the end grain is totally sealed. The end grain is where it picks up the most moisture, so legs are an area that's like a real liability with outdoor furniture. So by putting this epoxy there, I just kind of protect the foot and prevent moisture from wicking up, and that seems to have held up really well. And the legs are in pretty great condition outside of a little bit of finish being brushed off. There's no evidence of splitting or excessive moisture absorption there, so that held up pretty well. So as far as maintenance goes on this piece, I actually think they are due for a new coat. So I probably should be taking them into the shop, giving them a light sanding, especially in those worn areas, just smooth it out and apply a fresh coat of Epifanes on top of what's here, and that should give me another couple of years at least. Built in 2013 in Arizona from Western red cedar, this table would be about 8 years old now, if it were still around. This table's history is complicated. I initially finished it a little bit lazily with Watco teak oil. I say lazily because I only applied a single coat. You know how it is, you want to start using that project as soon as possible and you want that sweet family photo using the table. So you tell yourself that you'll apply the other coats later, and you never do. After a few years in Arizona and then a move to Denver, this table was in really bad shape by 2017, 4 years later. So I decided to do something about it. The epoxy sealer and marine varnish combo had worked well on other things in the past, so I decided to use it on the table. I first filled all gaps and cracks with epoxy, sanded it back, and then applied Total Boat epoxy sealer. This was my first time using this product, as I usually use CPES, but the zero VOC aspect was really appealing. The whole thing was then top coated with Epifanes marine varnish. When it was done, it actually looked better than the original because it retained some of that rustic look and the battle scars of life. I think that finish is going to hold up quite nicely. Nope! Unfortunately, only 2 years later, in 2019, the Denver sun had already taken its toll and the table was flaking and gross again. So, we bought a metal table. Problem solved! The old table has since suffered a fiery death. Just kidding, but it was clear that this table was not meant to be, so I cannibalized it and made it into a smaller table that would then live in a more hospitable environment under our back patio cover. The new coffee table was finished with Osmo One Coat HS, which is a hard wax oil that contains some pigments. The pigments help block UV, and the finish itself doesn't create a film, so there's nothing to flake off over time. And the wood can freely absorb and lose moisture without causing any major issues, at least in theory. It's now 2 years old, so let's see how the table is doing. Alright, so it's been about 2 years, and it's in the middle of winter. I think Nicole would kill me if she knew that I was taking video of our back patio in the middle of winter, because it looks terrible. But as I clean this off, you can see the top is in really great shape. I don't know what this red stain is. I'm going to have to ask Ava, because this is her table she uses most often. But overall, this is holding up really well. I don't see any evidence of cracks or splits. Everything that was repaired to get this piece into this condition and ready to go, it looks great. And it has what would be considered a lighter duty finish on it. So, I mean, when it comes to Western red cedar, I think this is the kind of finish I'm going to go for. But of course, we're under a patio cover here, so it still has exposure. It still gets a layer of snow on here periodically, a little bit of rain, but it is mostly covered, and the sunlight is limited. It's not a full day's worth of sun. But 2 years with nothing else being done to it, this is pretty darn good. But I want it to stay looking nice. I'm going to have to bring this guy back into the shop probably this week and put a new coat on it just to keep it up. But overall, man, I'm really happy with the way this turned out. Now, just in case you're curious, this is a bench that went with the original table and never received any refinishing. So the point that I got frustrated, got rid of the old table and built a new coffee table, that was the point that the failure was at. And this is what happens if you just let it go. And this is not only neglect, this is abuse, because at a certain point I had to spray paint something. It already looked like crap, so you can see that's where the black paint is coming from. This piece is still salvageable, and we are going to sand this down and refinish it. But this is where, I posted a picture of one of my benches with the initial failure, and a few people are like, oh, that looks great. They think it's a patina, when it's in fact a failing finish. And this is what happens if you continue to let it be abused by weather and stupid people who spray black spray paint around it. It just gets worse and worse. So this one definitely needs a little bit of work, but it's interesting to see how far a nasty flaking finish can go. Built in 2015 in Arizona, this African mahogany bench is now 6 years old. Originally finished with the CPES and Epifanes combo with a matte top coat. This piece actually lived inside for a few years because we needed a place to put on our shoes by the front door. In 2019, we didn't need it in the house anymore and decided to put it outside where it was originally intended to go. Alright, so the bench has had about 3 years of exposure and it lives in the same place as the Adirondack chair, so partial coverage, a couple hours of sun a day, definitely still gets some snow and water, but ultimately some protection. So let's see how it held up. All right, so overall, man, I gotta say, this thing is in great shape. There's really not a whole lot to point out. I think on the front edge, there's a little bit of wear. Certainly on this side, I see a little bit. Maybe a little bit of wear between the joints here, just because you've got movement between those pieces and it's a place for water to collect. But overall, this piece is in great shape, so I might even be able to give another year on this before I do a recoat. Really impressed with that. Made in August 2019 in Denver from Western Red Cedar, it's now 2 years old. Most outdoor wood structures should be left raw for a couple of seasons so that they can lose all of their free moisture. While I agree with this logic, I just couldn't imagine leaving the flat top slats completely unprotected for the summer and winter. So I did give them a light coat of Penofin Red. Penofin is an oil-based stain that contains lots of UV blocking pigments. It's not a film finish, so it gets brushed on and then wiped off. In April 2020, we were in full COVID lockdown mode, so there was no better time to finish a pergola. When I got on top of the structure, I saw some interesting differences between the finished boards and the unfinished supporting boards. The graying that you see there is just the natural aging process from 2 seasons, and look how different the finished boards look. So I applied finish to the entire thing, and it really took on a lovely warm color. Right, so it's been about a year since the finish was applied. I think we're probably nearing the time when I should be reapplying it again, but overall, everything is pretty good. I don't see any major cracks, any major things to worry about. Now, I haven't gotten up top to see what the condition of those flat slats are up there, but definitely one of those things where I think a yearly maintenance on this is going to be critical if I want to maintain this look. Overall, though, it's a pergola. I don't know that I'm going to be able to do it every year. Eventually, I think the UV is going to win the battle, and I might just get tired of putting coats of finish on it. But let's assume I do actually do that maintenance schedule. I think it's going to hold up pretty well, but so far, so good after 1 year. Made in 2017 in Denver using white oak, it's now about 4 years old. The original finish started with Thompson's water-sealed timber oil to add some color. I then applied CPES followed by Epifanes. While exposed, this gate is along the side of the house with a couple of trees on the other side. It spends most of its day just hanging around in the shade. Right, so it's been 4 years, and I would say the way the house is positioned, the location of the tree, the fact that this is in the shade most of the time has really benefited this gate because 4 years into it, and most of it is still in really good condition. All these panels are perfectly intact. I think our wear points, where we might expect them on our top surfaces, that's the thing we have to worry about. So check out some of this damage. And we can see a little bit of flaking finish here, but really not a ton of damage to worry about. The corners, obviously, we're down to bare wood here. So I think a good course of action now is to remove the flaking stuff, get it sanded nice and clean across the board and reapply some finish. Now, even though this top of the rail, or style, I guess you would call it, on this piece, this top piece actually doesn't look that great. Let's take a look at the other side. Even though it's a little bit dirty here, this one has actually held up even better, and I think it might just be the proximity of the wall, maybe protects it a little bit more from the elements, maybe even a little bit more UV blocking, but this is actually in perfect condition. Now this is a really interesting data point for me. This is part of the gate, which has the same finish as the rest of the gate. This part was added afterwards because this is just a support board that's actually anchored to this masonry wall. This I rushed. I actually did not put the full course of finish on there, just maybe 1 or 2 coats to quickly get this thing up and on the wall. And unfortunately, that rushing resulted in faded finish here. And this is a spot that's vertical. It's not even one that holds water or gets a ton of UV. So the number of coats definitely can impact the performance of the finish. All right, so this one is an interesting test case because this is not a piece that was stored outside, but I still think there's important data we can get from this. So back in 2005, I made this little, power carved contemplation bench, which eventually became a project in the guild, but it was sitting around the house for a while. And Nicole said, I'd really like to have some place to sit in the shower, because I guess that's what girls do. They like to sit in the shower. So this piece was available, and I decided to put some Epifanes on it, probably 4 coats on there. It's a good thick layer, and we put this in the shower. And it probably spent a good, 6-7 years in the shower with at least two hot showers a day. So it got wet. It got really wet. But what it didn't receive was UV exposure. So sitting in the shower all that time, and this finish is still intact. I don't see any place on this piece where I think it needs to be refinished. And that's just an important data point, because UV is terrible. It's absolutely the thing that's going to deteriorate the finish and then allow moisture infiltration. So this piece with tons of moisture exposure, of course in short bursts, still is in great condition, right? So very important data point there. All right, so with this whole experience, we have to be able to pull out some conclusions, some take-home messages, and I've got 10 of them for you today. Number 1, a failure doesn't necessarily mean that the finish is crap. All right, there's a lot of conditions that lead to a finish failing, including the wood species, how it was applied, the conditions it was stored in, and just how much exposure it received. And sometimes if you just do too much, it's just too much for the finish to handle, the finish fails. But none of this is really intended to be a review or commentary on the quality of the brands that we showed here. Some of it is just, look, it can only take so much abuse. With enough UV exposure and neglect, all finishes will fail. All right, and the difference between the non-film forming and the film forming finishes is that a film forming finish, even though it provides a little bit more protection, when it does fail, it's going to fail more spectacularly. You're going to see bubbles and flakes, and it's going to be a whole big thing to try to refinish it. And this is why in a lot of my stuff these days, I'm going more toward the hard wax oils and penetrating oils that don't form a film, because when I need to work on them, I can actually just sand it, apply new finish, and it'll be good to go. Now, number 3, in the past, you've heard me refer to Epifanes and CPES epoxy sealer as kind of a bulletproof finish. Well, very clearly, it's not. It can be very good in certain situations, but in others, with neglect and enough UV exposure, it's a mess, right? My table was an example of that, and I think the wood species has some impact on the results as well. So, even though it can be bulletproof in some circumstances, in others, it isn't. And again, not a dig on the finish. It's simply maybe using it for the wrong thing with the wrong expectations. Number 4, know yourself and know the situation. If you know where the piece is going to be stored and you know your willingness to do maintenance, you can kind of pick a finish that fits a little bit better for your style. If you don't think you're ever going to touch it again, well, maybe you don't want to just put a film on it and stick it out in the sun. That's probably not a great idea. Ultimately, if you don't want to do any maintenance at all, put on an oil finish, some kind of penetrating oil or oil wax, and let it go. It will gray over time, it will start to deteriorate over time, but at least you won't have a disgusting flaking finish. Number 5, now this is not so much a fact as my own observations through looking at all these pieces, and that is that UV is far worse than moisture. The UV degrades the finish, it causes it to lift and bubble, and then the moisture can get in. But it seems pretty clear that all of these finishes are going to be pretty adequate for protecting against moisture. But combine that UV in there and it can be game over. Number 6, pigments are your friend. A lot of times we just want to put clear finishes on things, and some clear outdoor finishes can have UV absorption as part of it, but nothing really absorbs or blocks UV better than pigments. So this is why a lot of deck stains will contain pigments. They bring color, which some people don't love, but the color is what's actually blocking the UV. It makes it much, much more effective. This is also why paint is one of the best outdoor finishes. Everybody gasp now, but paint is really good for outdoor projects because that's pretty much all it is, right? It is a coating that has tons of pigment in it and is pretty effective at blocking that UV from ever getting to the wood in the first place. But don't use paint if you don't have to. Paint's garbage. That's a joke. Number 7, I will probably never design a table, or let's just say tables, that have solid tops. With a solid top outside, if rain or snow gets on top of that, it just kind of sits there and collects, and that's just more exposure than a piece needs to experience. So anything I build from now on outside will have slats for the top, and that allows the wood pieces to breathe, they dry faster, and the water, of course, can just kind of run right through it and not collect on the top. Number 8, wood species really matters, right? So the Western red cedar table had so much trouble, and I think a good reason for that is because of how soft it is. It dents if you just look at it wrong. So every time something dropped on that table or a dog's nail scratched across it, we would get a dent. The dent actually stresses the finish, and over time can kind of thin it out so that when it fails, it's going to fail in those points where there was damage. Now, if the wood was a harder species like white oak or sapele, we may not have had that kind of damage because we never dented the wood in the first place, right? So the softer wood species can be more problematic with those film finishes. You do have to be careful with them. So, I don't love Western red cedar, but it is a pretty good rot-resistant wood. And when I use it from now on, like I did with the Pergola and like I did with the second version of the coffee table, I will be using a non-film forming finish that allows the wood to breathe and dry. It absorbs moisture, but it also loses that moisture really fast. Number 9, the epoxy feet that I started doing years ago actually is pretty effective, and I kind of theorized that it would be, but after seeing these pieces and inspecting them closely, it's pretty clear to me that that little epoxy pad on the foot goes a long way to protect the wood and stop it from absorbing moisture up through the end grain where it's most susceptible to it. And number 10, I think this is going to be what a lot of the comments on this video will be, is that there is no reason you have to fight the natural aging of wood. A lot of people like that weathered gray look, and if it's an outdoor species that has some rot resistance to it, you can just let it go. You don't have to do anything, right? So if that's your thing and you don't want to do all this maintenance, because obviously, as you can see, it's kind of a pain in the butt. There's a lot of products and a lot of them aren't going to work as well as you hope they would. Just letting it gray naturally, just like this, is actually not a bad thing. All right, so hopefully you found this useful, and once again, this is just my experience, and I would love to hear what different experiences with different products that you guys have had. Let me know in the comments. But ultimately, everybody's experience in a different region with different species of wood and different products, it's going to vary a lot, and you're going to hear a lot of differences. So the more you experiment, the better, because you'll see it for yourself and you'll know what to do. And real quick, I want to mention that most of the things I showed you today are actually projects either on the public main Wood Whisperer site or in the Guild. So there will be links in the description that you can go and actually see those projects come to life. All right, thanks for watching, everybody, and we'll see you next time.